Welcome to SPED 780 and the last module in this course, which focuses on transition planning. In this module, we really want to take a look at the different pieces and parts of transition planning, what plays into how we plan for students post K-12, and look at some tools that we can use to do that transition planning. I think the most important thing to remember when we're looking at transition planning, even when we start in middle school, when we start those early initial transition meetings, is this is a pretty overwhelming process for families to think about, just in terms of students have less support once they get out of high school. So when they're in K-12 settings, that IEP coordinator, the special ed case manager, that person is primarily determining what needs the student has, what services are going to be provided. The parents aren't going out and seeking those services. They're not trying to line up those services for their child, which is very much what it's like when they get out of K-12. They're very much more the case manager in that situation. The other piece that can be a little bit overwhelming is students no longer have that daily place that they go, where they're school, and they're working on these skills. Sometimes parents really have to look at, what do I want my child, or what are they capable of doing during their day when they get out of school. If they're going to go into some kind of post-secondary training, if they're going to go into some kind of a workshop type environment, if they're going to go into a career, what does that look like? There's a lot of unknowns that parents face. The other challenging thing, I think, for parents from their perspective on transition planning is it seems unending, for lack of a better term. So, when kids are in, let's say I'll use our example. So Josie's in second grade this year. Okay, right now our focus primarily is on, okay, what skills is Josie learning in second grade? And then at the end of the year, we're going to kind of see that, chapter close, and we're going to start getting ready for third grade. Once she gets out of school, it's not broken down so easily. We're going to be worried about life skills. We're going to be worried about financial planning, that she is able to live as independently as she wants to because of the financial savings and planning that we've done, getting up to that point. And it can be pretty overwhelming for parents, even looking at services. One of the things I know that we're even looking at now in terms of transition planning, even though Josie's in second grade, is getting her on the developmental disability waiver. And this is a waiver program through the state of Kansas. If you teach in Missouri, they're going to have something similar. Oklahoma has something similar. But it provides things like a job coach once she reaches 18. Things like medical support. For example, she has a G-tube, so if she had a nurse that she needed assistance from, it would provide that. Right now in the state of Kansas, there's an 8-year wait to even have your paperwork considered for the DD waiver. So right now Josie's 9. If we get that paperwork in this year and there's an 8-year wait, we're looking at 17 before her paperwork comes up for consideration. And then she's going to turn 18 and she's going to need those services in place. So it's pretty overwhelming to think about. Even at second grade, we need to start thinking about transition planning and what services we want in place, right? If we don't, then we reach 18 and a lot of those things aren't lined up and in place, and it takes a while to get all those services set up. And it's also something that the parents do very much independently. It's not like they have a case manager like they do in K-12 that's helping them through that process. It's rare that they would have that. So I think just as you're working with parents, it's really good to be just aware of the overwhelming nature of transition. It also serves as a reminder of your child's disability. And, I say that not necessarily as a negative, but it can be overwhelming to think, I don't know if my child's going to be able to move out of the home, or I don't know if they're going to be able to have a job that they are self-sustaining and independent. Those are tough questions for parents to process. And so I just encourage you to keep those things in mind as you're working in transition planning. I know it's easy for those of us who live and breathe special ed every day. We talk about these things like transition. It's something we do on a regular basis. And it's not always maybe overwhelming for us as it is for parents who aren't always thinking about these things on a daily basis. So one of the things that I like to think about in terms of transition planning is looking at it as a person-centered plan. So really the sole focus is on the student, and the student can really play a part in that transition planning. They can help identify assessments that they think need to be conducted, with the teacher guiding them on that. And really bring their family into that as well, their parents. Participating in those assessments is extremely important for them to have buy-in and participate in those. And then identifying information from the assessment to really help with the plan. So looking at those assessment results with them and saying, let's think about what your strengths and your weaknesses are. Let's think about what this assessment is telling us jobs. You have skills for these types of jobs, okay? Or you have an interest inventory you've completed, and it shows us that you really like to work in this area. Really having that person-centered planning approach. So when we look at the purpose of assessment in transition, it's a little bit different than how we typically look at assessment within the IEP process, because it's really kind of has more of a predictive nature to it, because our transition plan is for post-high school. So one of the big things that we use assessment for is that determination of career development. So really identifying initially like career awareness, if students understand what different careers entail. Do they kind of have an orientation to a particular career, allowing them to explore a career, and then also kind of some growth and maintenance within a career. So if we find a job that they are drawn to, that they really like, how do we develop skills within that job and kind of maintain that? Measurement, when we look at measurement and assessment for transition, that's where we're just really looking at identifying strengths, identifying capabilities, identifying maybe potential that they have for different careers or different post-secondary training opportunities, those kinds of things. Even looking at, in terms of measurement, what kind of community supports they already have in place, what kind of employment possibilities are already within their community or the neighborhood that they live in, those kinds of things. When we look at prediction, here we're wanting to really look at assessment that matches up interests and strengths with training and post-secondary training, employment, those kinds of things. Prescription, here we're really identifying strengths and needs, and then we want to recommend different types of techniques, different types of strategies that are going to help students really improve their career preparation and development. So prescription is really telling us, okay, we know that student A wants to do this, so these are the strategies and instructional processes we need to go through to get them ready to do that task, that job, okay? Exploration allows students to really try out different jobs. So they might go out to the community and do several different types of jobs just to see kind of what a good fit is for them. So I'll give you an example on exploration. My brother has a cognitive disability, and when he was going through his transition process in high school, he went to a number of different places for employment during his junior year. So he worked at like a CarMax or an AutoZone, someplace like that, stocking shelves. He worked in a grocery store, and then he spent some time working at Walmart in the electronics department. And so it really allowed him to look at different types of businesses, different tasks within businesses, and identify jobs that really fit him well. Again, interventions where we're really working on those remedial strategies to help students work on those career job options. So for example, intervention with Phil, one of the things they worked on was stocking shelves and how to do that well. The other thing they worked on was greeting customers and the social aspect of working with customers. So that would be an example of intervention. And then advocacy is really helping students develop, and their parents kind of a concrete career profile of what they want to do when they get out of school, that they're going to be able to use and really focus on in terms of meeting their transition goals. So some typical assessment procedures that we use to get this assessment data. Sometimes we use standardized tests. That gives us good information on students' academic abilities, especially if we're looking at post-secondary training and education. Interviews are really helpful, especially with parents, with the student, to really determine what their strengths are, what their needs are, what their hopes and goals are for the future. Direct observation is helpful, especially if you have a student already in a workplace environment, doing some direct observation of how they're working in that environment, or if they're looking at post-secondary training, observing them in the classroom and how they're learning in a general ed classroom that would look more like a college classroom. Functional assessments gives us a lot of good information on things like life skills, type things that students may need to work on, that we may need to address a goal for, whether it's things like time management, money management, maybe things like dressing themselves and personal hygiene. Those things we can really determine where the student's skill level is with functional assessments. And then curriculum-based measurements also give us some good data on post-secondary education and kind of where students, where their strengths and weaknesses would be, and things that we want to make sure that we work on before they get out of high school so that they're prepared for those post-secondary education settings, whatever those may be. Some other things within using a variety of assessments, parent-family questionnaires, those are real helpful. You'll see some links to examples of those within the module resources that you can use. Employer interviews are helpful. If you have a student that's been working on a job site all year, going and interviewing that employer gives you some really great information on what the student's strengths are, what their areas of need are in terms of identifying some strategies to work on. Situation assessments are also helpful. You can do situation assessments for things like life skills. For example, maybe preparing a meal for themselves, or a situational assessment on going to the grocery store with a list and being able to manage that, buy what you need for the week, and managing your money to do that. Same with community-based checklists. They can kind of fall under that. Even using a community-based checklist, maybe for something like using public transportation. How do we do that? For example, Phil in the past has used public transportation to get to his work. He works at a neighborhood market. And, he would have a situation where maybe his driver was sick and would call in and say, typically not with a lot of notice, maybe 15 minutes before they were supposed to pick him up, he'd get a phone call and say, hey, we can't pick you up today. Now, he lives close enough he can walk to work, but if it's super cold out or if it's storming, what do you do in that situation? That always kind of throws him off. So really, my parents had to work with him on strategies of, okay, if your driver isn't there, here's the first person you call to see if they can pick you up. If that person is out of town or unavailable, here's the second person you need to call, putting that up on his fridge. So he kind of had some strategies for if there are issues with transportation, how would I deal with that? So one of the things that, I think is important is including formal assessment within the transition process. We just need to understand the limitations of formal assessment. And the reason I say that is I think the transition process is so unique in terms of how individualized we need to make it and how person-centered it is, that sometimes formal assessment, while it plays a role, is not our primary focus when we do a transition assessment. It's a good starting place. It's a good place to kind of give us some direction on some informal assessments we need to complete. But it's just really good to know that there are some limitations. First of all, like standardized assessments, they're really not designed for interpreting them in terms of transition needs or needs that students may have post-high school, with particularly students with special needs. Now, there is a standardized assessment called the Transition Planning Inventory, TPI-2. It is standardized, and it does focus on transition planning for students with disabilities. It's not something that a lot of schools use yet, but there's one standardized assessment out there that we can use for transition. The other things that we kind of need to be aware of and kind of be cautious about with formal assessments is we can kind of fall in that trap of using the results to label or stigmatize a student. Okay? There can also be errors within that formal assessment, just test bias, low reliability, poor validity, those kinds of things we have to be aware of. And we also just really need to consider the student's background, their age, their developmental level when we're doing these formal assessments, their reading ability, the primary language, those kinds of things. To give you an example, we just had Josie's 3-year re-eval. And so her primary language, her first language is ASL. Her second language is English. So she is an English, second language English learner, okay? So she was given a number of standardized assessments for her 3-year re-eval. And when we were presented those results, the team really talked about how we need to consider that that test was developed for a student who is proficient in English, and Josie is not. You know, that plays a role in how we interpret those results. So it's really just important to think about those things as we're identifying formal assessments. I tend to build transition plans more on informal assessments for the most part. Really doing a good case file review of the student, looking at previous IEP goals, looking at their previous assessments that have been done. I think interviews are always really helpful to kind of paint a picture of what the student's strengths and weaknesses are. And we've talked about some of these already, some situational assessment, observation, those kinds of things. So we've got 2 types of assessments we can do, formal and informal. And within those, those both play a critical role in putting that transition picture together for us. We just need to make sure that we use a variety of both of those assessment tools. So I like this graph. This is actually from the Transition Coalition for the University of Kansas. It's one of the best known resources out there for transition planning at the secondary level. And this talks about information that we need to have a student-focused planning process. And I think this is really good when we're thinking about what assessments that we select, that we have this picture in our mind, because it really helps us think about what information we need to get. So if I know that I need, for example, background information, I'm probably going to do a records review to get some of that background information. But if I need, I know to paint a whole picture of what the student can do, I need a learning preferences or learning styles. Well, then I may do an inventory with the student, asking them some questions. Or worker personal characteristics. I may interview their employer that they're working with right now to get that information. This is a really good place to start and think about, okay, if I want all of this information to truly have a really good student-focused plan and a really good picture of what the student can do and what they want to do when they get out of high school, kind of plug in what assessments I need to get this information. So I think this is a great place for you to start as you start looking at transition planning and identifying an assessment for a particular student. One of the resources that you'll find within the module folder is a great link with some awesome assessment tools that you can just download and use. And one of them that they have in there is this parent input sheet. And I love this because it really allows parents to give you some good information on a variety of things like educational information, maybe daily living skills, maybe some preferences they have for goals, those kinds of things. And it really asks some good questions. Here I did a screen capture of just the residential and work information. So one of the questions it says is, what chores does your child do on a regular basis at home? And then it also gets into, has your child ever done paid work for family, friends, or neighbors? Do they have transportation available for your child to and from work? Are there places near your home that you would like your child to work? Okay, lots of different questions that kind of help you guide what that parent's goal is when the student gets out of school and what's feasible for them. You know, if the student says, hey, I want to work at Best Buy, but it's 15 miles from my parents' house, I don't have access to transportation, I don't know anybody that works there. You know, it kind of helps you think about, okay, what are the challenges for us getting to that end goal? What are some things that we can put in place to get the student to that workplace, okay? Student input, I like this because this is kind of a rating scale that students can do. And And it rates not like me, somewhat like me, or very much like me. And then it walks through some statements. For example, I buy things at the store on my own. Okay, I save money for things I want to buy. I know how to wash my clothes according to the label. I usually know how much money I have in savings. I store food so it doesn't spoil or go bad. So just lots of different, this is just daily living, but there's lots of different categories that you can ask within this form. There's a link for it in the module. But this really also helps us determine some goals, because if you think, if the student says, not like me, on I can fix meals for myself on my own, hey, that would be a great goal for us to work on while they're in school, that the student after high school is going to be able to fix meals that are nutritious independently and on their own. Okay? We'll take a break here and pick up in the next video on developing transition goals.